Good morning and welcome to this US Studies Centre event as part of our Alliance21 project. My name's Jeff Garrett. I have the privilege of being the Chief Executive Officer of the US Studies Centre, and I wanted to acknowledge the fact that my boss, Malcolm Binks, arrived from the United States yesterday. So welcome, Malcolm, to your home away from home in Sydney. For those of you interested in green growth, it might seem a little strange that it would be badged as part of an event on the future of US-Australia relations, where most people in Australia seem to think about that relationship almost exclusively in political, military and security terms. But the fundamental premise of our Alliance21 project is that US-Australia relations today are much broader and much deeper than most people appreciate, and that the future of US-Australia relations, whilst being rock solid, will surely play out quite differently and face different challenges from the first 60 years of the US-Australia alliance. So, our Alliance21 project certainly has a focus on defence and security issues and is very centrally engaged in the issue of the impact of emerging Asia on US-Australia and our shared relationship. But it goes much broader than that. We have foci on trade and investment, on energy security, on education and innovation. And today's event is part of our natural resources and the environment strand led by my friend and colleague Robert Hill, who you'll see on the podium quite soon. So green growth, we believe, is central to the future of US-Australia relations. Why? Well, obviously in the US and Australia today, the twin issues of innovating into a low-carbon economy and figuring out how to be a high-cost but successful manufacturing economy are of critical importance not only to Australia and the US, but in fact to the whole Western world. What we hope to do today, and this is really the MO of the Centre more generally, is to bring together expertise from Australia and the US to share experiences with a view to informing both what happens in both countries individually, but also in identifying opportunities for collaboration between new forms of collaboration between Australia and the US. Our Alliance21 project is really a very large-scale undertaking. This year we hope to publish approximately 50 think tank-style papers on the 6 themes in our project. It's a project whose fundamental support came from the Gillard government, has come from the Gillard government, but at least as importantly for us, it's been matched by very generous contributions from the corporate sector, from large multinational firms with interests in Australia and the United States. And one of those companies is going to be very well represented not only in the room today, but I gather by video conference as well. Dow Chemical and its CEO and Chairman Andrew Liveris have been extraordinarily strong supporters of the US Studies Centre really from the very beginning, and of the American-Australian Association, one of the parents of the Centre. And as I think many of you know, Dow and Andrew Liveris personally are leading the quest, the challenge to find advanced manufacturing options in the United States today. And Andrew has also become very heavily involved in the Australian debate. So I wanted to thank, I see the CEO of Dow in Australia, Craig Arnold, is with us this morning. I want to thank Craig and Dow for all their support of this centre. It's absolutely critical to what we do. But of course, the name of the game, I think, for any non-profit institution is leverage. We want to leverage things as much as we possibly can. And today's event has benefited from the active support and participation of 2 important peak associations in Australia, Sustainable Business Australia and the Australian Industry Group. I'm very glad that leaders from both those organisations are able to be with us today, and certainly their networks and expertise will multiply the impact of what we do here today. My fourth word of thanks is to the United States government, represented this morning by the Consul General in Sydney, Niels Marquardt, who is an extraordinarily generous supporter personally and institutionally of the US Studies Centre with government resources and his time. Niels and I were together just a few days ago celebrating a wonderful new study abroad program in Los Angeles that Niels has supported and helped make possible. The consulate provides intern opportunities for our students. Niels' support, the consulate's support, the support of Ambassador Jeffrey Bleich in Canberra are really essential to what the centre does. So I wanted to thank and acknowledge Niels' presence here this morning. My last word is really a handoff now. And the handoff is to the Deputy Premier of New South Wales, the Honourable Andrew Stoner MP, who's also Minister for Trade and Investment and has another ministerial portfolio allowing him to keep his hands in everything rural and regional in New South Wales, his passion and his personal biography. Andrew also has personally been a strong supporter and participant in the work of the US Studies Centre. Actually, as part of a different project on the future of higher education, we had the benefit of the Deputy Premier's presence at a workshop we held at the centre just last month. I should also mention that the New South Wales government is a core financial supporter of the US Studies Centre, where the New South Wales government buys into our value proposition, which is that bringing American expertise and American experiences to the table in Australia and understanding those experiences, leveraging them and adapting them and adopting them in an Australian context and particularly a New South Wales context is particularly important. Obviously, the still new O'Farrell government has a massive agenda of reform and change in the state, and I know that developing advanced manufacturing is a key element in the state government's long-term strategic view of where the state must go. So I'm very anxious to cede the podium and to hear from the Deputy Premier. Can you all please join me in welcoming to this event today?
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to join you today to look ahead to what promises to be an engaging and interesting focus on Australian and US approaches to green growth and advanced manufacturing. Firstly, let me thank Professor Robert Hill AO for extending to me his kind invitation to join you today. I know Robert has taken a strong interest in the New South Wales Government's renewed focus on developing growth in our advanced manufacturing sector as part of his role as adjunct professor in sustainability at the US Studies Centre. I'd also like to thank Jeff and his team at the US Studies Centre for once again bringing together an outstanding group of sector leaders, policymakers and academics from both the US and Australia. Acknowledgements also well deserved for the Australian Industry Group and Sustainable Business Australia, who've made significant contributions in helping to select a prestigious audience to match a prestigious program of speakers. Yours truly not included in that last description. Can I also acknowledge the US Consul General in Sydney, Niels Marquardt, a great mate. In fact, just last week we had quite a night tasting some very good US wines at his residence. Great to see you, Niels. The partnership between the US Studies Centre and the New South Wales Government is driving outstanding engagement and thinking across a number of areas, including manufacturing, clean technology, business and financial services, defence, higher education, and the digital media sectors. Now, these are all sectors to which the New South Wales Government is applying particular focus in our efforts to rebuild our state's economy and reposition New South Wales for long-term economic growth. My agency, New South Wales Trade and Investment, facilitates attraction and retention of sustainable investment and innovation in New South Wales, and has the job of positioning Sydney and our state internationally as the #1 business gateway to Australia and the Asia Pacific. Now, of course, a priority market for Australia and New South Wales is the United States. The US remains our leading source of foreign direct investment and our third largest trading partner. Since the new state government took office in March last year, we've sought actively to build on this special relationship with the US, driving deeper engagement and connections to create new business opportunities. In fact, we recently launched a new trade and investment office in San Francisco to help us drive investment, promote trade, and highlight New South Wales expertise across sectors including financial services, digital services, ICT, R&D, clean technology, and advanced manufacturing. Now, as I mentioned, our government's #1 priority is to restore economic growth in New South Wales and establish our state as the first place in Australia to do business. Now, from the outset, we understood that to achieve this required significantly more strategic focus and deeper levels of engagement with industry leaders in key sectors than had existed before. We established a number of high-level industry-led task forces to develop action plans for the next decade for priority sectors including professional services, the digital economy, creative industries, tourism and major events, international education and research, and manufacturing. Now, 4 of these task forces, professional services, the digital economy, international education and research, and manufacturing, will be submitting their final recommendations for action to the government in the coming weeks, following many months of intense consultation with industry and communities right around the state. Our government also recently released a draft Renewable Energy Action Plan to guide renewable energy development and support the national target of 20% renewable energy by 2020. Our draft plan proposes 28 actions to attract renewable energy investment and projects, build community support for renewable energy, attract and grow expertise in renewable energy technology, and contain costs for energy customers through increased energy efficiency. Now, I've been asked to talk about advanced manufacturing as a key sector in New South Wales, so I first want to provide you with some background on the landscape for this sector. New South Wales has the largest manufacturing sector of any state in Australia, accounting for 32% of the national industry. New South Wales manufactured exports were worth $16.1 billion in 2011, and much of the value of these exports came from so-called elaborately transformed manufactures, or ETMs. I'll stick with the ETMs, that's much easier to say. These ETMs are sophisticated forms of manufacture, for instance, medicinal and pharmaceutical products and professional and scientific equipment, respectively worth $1.4 billion and $907 million annually to our economy. Drilling deeper into these numbers, 2 New South Wales manufacturing subsectors containing many advanced manufacturing intensive companies, that is, food processing and machinery and equipment, accounted for over a quarter of our total manufactured exports. Over the last 7 years, New South Wales ETM exports have risen by 3.2%, whereas the rest of Australia's ETM exports have gone backwards by 1.3%. New South Wales has particular strengths and capabilities in design, logistics, and information and communications technology, renewable energy, and sustainable building products. And it's these strengths that support the ongoing development of high-value processes. We also have the high-level skills, R&D and research capabilities, and world-class infrastructure to match, making New South Wales an attractive location for advanced manufacturing companies. Companies like BlueScope Steel Australia, Amcor, Forjax Group, Browens Industries and Drivetrain Systems International all use New South Wales as their base of operations in Australia and globally. Their ongoing growth and success is testament to the innovation and focus on high value add of our advanced manufacturing firms, even more impressive in light of ever-increasing global competition and the ongoing strength of the Australian dollar. Their success also sheds light on an important theme emerging from our Manufacturing Industry Task Force, as well as the Prime Minister's Manufacturing Task Force, about which you'll hear more later from a member of that task force, Professor Roy Green, Dean of the Business School at the University of Technology, Sydney. We know that competition on cost is no longer a reality for manufacturers in New South Wales and indeed Australia. In a globalised economy where labour costs in competitor markets are a fraction of ours, our future international success can only be achieved by moving up the value chain, boosting our productivity, developing expertise in core capabilities, better understanding the needs of customers and end users, and creating valuable IP with design-led innovation. Now, this latter trend has been one of the drivers behind, for instance, the New South Wales Government's collaboration with the Commonwealth and also South Australia on a pilot design integration program for manufacturing SMEs. Strategic understanding and implementation of design-led innovation and differentiation are incredibly important in delivering competitive advantage and more value to customers and end users. I'd like to point to a well-known brand based right here in New South Wales as an example. The small kitchen appliance company, Breville. Breville designs and engineers high-end kitchen appliances for the global market from its Centre for Design Excellence here in Sydney, with assembly undertaken offshore. The company reported an 8.7% increase in global revenues for last financial year, as well as a 44.9% year-on-year increase in net profits after tax. Breville enjoyed particular success in North America, with a 22.4% increase in revenues and a 79.3% increase in earnings before interest and tax year-on-year. This new paradigm for manufacturing is illustrated by another example, Cochlear Limited, based in Lane Cove here in Sydney. Many of you be aware that Cochlear make and market innovative, implantable hearing devices for adults and children with moderate to profound hearing loss. Cochlear is a broad-based medical device company delivering hearing solutions for the hearing impaired with over 2,000 employees, direct operations in over 20 countries, and product sales in over 100 companies with annual turnover exceeding $700 million. Cochlear reinvests over 13% of revenues on R&D, a significant investment in the future growth of the company. Another example, which brings together green growth and manufacturing, is what will be one of Australia's largest solar projects. It will be built in New South Wales following AGL Energy and PV manufacturer First Solar being awarded a $130 million grant from the federal government's Solar Flagships program, which supports the construction of large-scale grid-connected solar power stations. This $450 million project will be built across 2 sites in Western New South Wales, Broken Hill and Nyngan, and will generate enough electricity to power 30,000 homes when completed by the end of 2015. This 159 megawatt project will ensure that Australia brings industrial-scale solar power to market. Our government also wants to make our state the first place for local and international researchers, companies and investors to do business. We want our manufacturers to be at the leading edge, leveraging new developments and expertise to secure their place in an increasingly competitive global environment. Our vision for the manufacturing sector in our state is one which is highly competitive both domestically and globally, has a flexible and highly skilled workforce, has a strong emphasis on innovation and collaboration, is responsive to growing environmental concerns and challenges, is attractive to investors both domestically and internationally, and which has a broad New South Wales-wide base, that is Sydney and regional New South Wales. We want to achieve this by continuing to work closely with the sector to deliver greater investment in manufacturing, growth in high-performing and high-value-add subsectors, improved management and process innovation, application of advanced technologies and development of sustainable practice, collaboration to improve efficiency in local and global supply chains, and a stronger skills base to maintain and build our competitiveness. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's a bit of an overview of where the New South Wales Government is targeting growth. We've had enormous input from our industry, which, as I suggested in the description of the landscape, is highly competitive in Australia and in our region in the Asia-Pacific. If anyone would like further information about the details, please contact me through New South Wales Trade and Investment, particularly in the months ahead as the government responds to the recommendations of those industry task forces. There will be a fair bit more detail around that. I look forward to hearing more about the insights emerging from today's exchange, and once again offer my thanks to Robert and Jeff for the kind invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Premier. It should come as no surprise, of course, that the Deputy Premier has a rather busy day, so we'll have to allow him to get on with the business of running the state. So thank you very much for your time this morning. My last formal obligation this morning is to introduce the real master of ceremonies and the person who put this event together, the Honourable Robert Hill AC, who wears lots of hats that are relevant to this event. He's adjunct professor in sustainability at the US Studies Centre. With me, he's co-director of our Alliance21 project, and he's also the theme leader in that project for our natural resources and the environment theme. So, Robert, please may I welcome you to the stage and hand over the reins of this event to you.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the Deputy Premier. It's good to hear that New South Wales is rising to the challenge in this very important area. Now, we're already a few minutes behind time, so our first session is really the comparison of the plan of President Obama in the United States of America and the developing plan of the federal government in Australia. And to speak to us on the US side, I'm hoping she's about to appear on this screen. We wanted to hear in person but couldn't, so aha, it is now. Can you hear us, Teresa?
I can hear you.
Excellent, excellent. You wouldn't want to know the troubles that we went to this morning to make this technology work. So thank you very much, Teresa, for your patience and cooperation in that regard. Teresa Katanchik has an extraordinary CV. She's a Doctor of Philosophy in Materials Science, a Master of Science in Ceramic Science, Bachelor of Science in Ceramic Science and Engineering from Penn State University. She is the Global Director, Sustainable Technologies and Innovation Policy of the Dow Chemical Company. Her mission, as I understand it, is a growth strategy through market-driven scientific and technological innovations, enhancing current products as well as creating new business and technology platforms. As many of you know, and as Jeff mentioned, Andrew Liveris, the Chief Executive of Dow, Chief Executive and President and other things of Dow, was one of the joint co-chairs of President Obama's steering committee that helped develop this latest plan. And my inside information is that a lot of the hard work that was put into the plan from a technical perspective was actually provided by Teresa. So there's really no better person, I think, from the United States to tell us about what the plan is for the US in this important area, and how the US is going to revive and build a new advanced manufacturing sector. And after her, we'll listen to the Australian perspective, and then hopefully we can have a bit of a debate on what we think in terms of the best policy options for the future. So Teresa, you're going to chat to us for about 20 minutes, and then I'm very grateful that you're prepared to answer some questions from the floor. Over to you.
By way of background, I think it's worthwhile to pause and understand what was the origin of this particular initiative. In June of 2011, the Presidential Council on Advancement of Science and Technology had brought forward a report entitled Ensuring American Leadership in Advanced Manufacturing. And out of it, there were really three major factors that moved forward of why is it of critical importance for the U.S. to revitalize advanced manufacturing. The first, of course, is pertaining to jobs and manufacturing, providing high-quality, good-paying jobs for American workers. The second piece really around innovation by keeping the manufacturing local, design, engineering scale-up, production processes and feedback, and what that enables in next generation opportunities and growth. And the third critical piece was really centered around security and the importance of having a domestic manufacturing footprint in support of that. Of course, underpinning all of these recommendations were the realities of the employment trends that had transpired on the U.S. side, of really the challenges emanating in the early 2000 time period in total of employment moving from on the order of 17 million to that at the close of the last year around 12 million, and the significant impact that that has. Of course, associated with this on a world manufacturing output factor, since the year 2000, the significant shift from U.S. to China. And in fact, when we look at U.S. to China export ratio in the year 2000, that being on the order of 300%, and by 2012 it's 72%. Nonetheless, export, U.S. being a number 3 manufacturing exporter, and the importance of manufactured produced goods being over 60% of that export base, continues to drive a focus on the impact on, obviously, on the economy. Now, an interesting factor when you look at U.S. trade balance in that time period of post-2000 to current time, in examining the trade balance of all manufactured products versus those of advanced technology products, we were seeing that the trade imbalance was still a positive one up through about 2000, 2001, and then we also saw the shift of moving into negative trade balance. And so the call out of a real challenge of what actions need to be taken. Further compounding this is a realization of comparing advanced technology and advanced manufacturing-based industries and their R&D intensity. In the U.S., the science and engineering workforce, if you will, are more than 70% are really employed by scientists and engineers by manufacturers. And then furthermore, if you look at the differences between R&D intensity of various sectors, particularly the advanced manufacturing sectors that overlay pharma, semiconductor, much higher R&D intensity, and with that, a close correlation and realization of percent change in manufacturing output versus those which are not as R&D intensive. So the net of the initial PCAS report, and then on the heels of that, the launch of the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, which in fact was in July of 2011. The partnership, as we'll get into, entailed both 12 industrial members, of which Andrew Liveris, the CEO of Dow Chemical, co-chaired, with the university president, in this case Susan Hockfield, who was then president of MIT, along with 6 other academic partners. The mission of the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership is really captured here, with the intent of identifying collaborative opportunities between industry, academia, and government that will catalyze the development and investment in emerging technologies, also underpinning a policy and partnerships to reinvigorate advanced manufacturing in the U.S. And there are 3 major outcomes that were being sought with that. The first call was the development of a proposed permanent model for evaluating, prioritizing, and recommending federal investments in advanced manufacturing. The second piece was really a call of an initial set of partnership projects that would be focused on high-impact technologies. And the third piece was to provide additional recommendations to the administration on actions that would be required to support investment in advanced manufacturing. Of course, advanced manufacturing in and of itself, given the number of both public and private institutes engaged, we paused to ensure everyone had clarity over what that meant. In this case, looking at both conventional and novel products through processes that depend on the coordination of information, automation, computation, software, sensing, networking, so the underpinnings of the impacts of digital economy and supporting infrastructure for cutting-edge materials and emerging scientific capabilities. So that became the working definition of what is advanced manufacturing and, if you will, what's in scope or out of scope. In terms of the AMP steering team, the team was composed of the CEOs of the 12-member companies that are listed here. As you can see, all multinationals of $1 billion in excess of annual revenue, but quite a diversity of industry members. Allegheny Technologies, which is in the intermetallic advanced metal systems, Caterpillar, Corning Glass, Dow Chemical, Ford, Honeywell, Intel, Johnson & Johnson, Northrop Grumman, Procter & Gamble, Stryker, and United Technologies. The 6 universities, University of California, Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon University, Georgia Tech, MIT, University of Michigan, and Stanford. And then in addition, we had an operating group of representatives of the major agencies that were touching the advanced manufacturing sector. Given the scope and objectives, how do we organize ourselves? I was asked today to talk about both the process and key learnings that may be leverageable. In this particular case, we aligned around 5 work streams. Each were co-led by an industry representative as well as a academic representative, with the respective objectives that are laid out here. The technology work stream really had the responsibility of definition of the permanent mechanism as well as the initial set of top technology areas. Shared infrastructure and facilities was really challenging what are alternate models and opportunities to de-risk and scale up, how to really leverage the know-how and expertise both in private and public sector for advancing, and particularly the challenges for small and medium enterprises in addition to the large enterprises. Education and workforce really came to the surface in terms of barriers and constraints within the U.S. environment and what tangible actions could be taken. Of course, a whole framework around policy incentives, and then also a recognition amongst the team that outreach was going to be important, moving beyond the large industry members and the academic forces to the criticality of community colleges as well as the small and medium enterprises. So to address that, we actually conducted 4 regional meetings in a matter of 60 days across the U.S. One was held in the southern part in Atlanta and Boston, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then in actually Ann Arbor. We had over 1,200 participants in that, again covering small, medium, and large companies and a variety of trade organizations. In addition, we had each of the work streams working with outreach with the National Association of Manufacturers, NCMS, etc., and interviews with key leaders at the various departments, Department of Labor, Small Business Administration, etc. We also had very targeted outreach with trade groups, engagement at Capitol Hill, and again, a very high engagement of Department of Energy, Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, Department of Labor. Net, the final report was released in July of this past year, so just a matter of a couple of months ago. And I do have a link to the report. The recommendations fell out under three major categories. The first around enabling innovation, second around securing a talent pipeline, and the third around improving business climate. And we'll walk through those briefly to give you a context of those. But before doing so, I'd also like to hit some of the mechanisms, as that was a question I was asked, on how do we go about gathering the data. One of the first pieces on the reach on our survey were to elicit opinions both from industry and academia. First set of questions were really to our industry sectors, identifying what were top manufacturing industries which were targeted for the largest future investments and over the next 10 years from the U.S. with both economic and national impact. We also asked a question for those industries that were being targeted for investment, what were the critical advanced manufacturing technologies that would be required, and then inputs on the preferred public-private partnerships which would make sense to accelerate those. There are a variety of workshops that were conducted with industry university partners. These were really used to call out the specificity on a number of the targeted technologies, and then furthermore, white paper solicitations from subject matter experts. In parallel, a number of benchmarking studies are really looking not only from a U.S. vantage point in the inputs, but also what other countries and regions had done, and also comparative between what the members were bringing forward as targets versus that of where there had been federal investment, if you will, in fiscal year 11 and 12. Now, in terms of learnings extraction, particular focus was given to Germany, Japan, and Korea. In comparison relative to the U.S., each have very clear national objectives and strategies for retaining manufacturing within country. Take a very hierarchical approach in the planning mechanism, very much driven by resource constraints and using that to incorporate the technology foresight processes. The other reality in all three countries are manufacturing still retains prestige at a career planning vantage point, and students' ability to carry out applied research in the universities and institutes, and then really getting that development and training through the internship programs that are supported that lead into manufacturing leader positions, which, as you'll see, is in contrast to many of the dynamics within the U.S. and where some of the recommendations hinge. Now, in terms of best run public-private partnership inputs, from the solicitation of feedback, have industry members involved in determining program goals and strategies. This may sound obvious when stated, but has not often been the case. Also, clear recognition of long-term goals and having stable funding mechanisms, not starts and stops that often come forward. Having the appropriate level of applied research and business focus with, of course, an intention to return on investment and associated metrics. With that means upfront industry funding commitments and really looking at the outcome recommendations and one-to-one match from day one is a very strong signal of true commitment moving forward. There is also a call out of the reality that many of the successes have truly been consortium of industry, government, university, where the consortia are able to bring across the value chain the right expertise for the appropriate road mapping and pre-competitive technologies that are required to move the forward. One of the call-outs that consistently came through, and again, this is really from the U.S. Side, is a real plea that government should focus its attention on defining the problem statement for the target and not necessarily pick the product technologies or the specifics in that regard, but leave the problem statement definition in their hands and let the contingent members bring back forward the best solutions. In terms of recommended program management, the program management, again, should involve industry and university, not purely on a government-led program management. The applied research programs run by industrial program managers, and the utilization of rigorous metrics. Of course, foundation is that contracting and award agreements both simplify and make more flexible the ease of access to intellectual property for the industry participants, knowing that the investments made, that they can rapidly bring those forward. So that gives you a framework of some of the general feedback that had come from the solicitation of the industry and academia members as we move forward for level setting best practices. Out of that, as we move through the 16 recommendations, the first piece is really around setting a 5-year National Advanced Manufacturing Strategic Plan and to utilize that for the prioritization of go-forward technology investments programs. In this case, we also looked at calling out who we felt was most appropriate for really advancing that recommendation. And in the course of the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership Steering Team being in place, the Advanced Manufacturing National Program Office was launched, which is to serve as coordination and alignment of the interagency programs. And we really look to that interagency group to help in putting the framework forward. The 4 legs of it are using the multiple inputs of industry, academia, and government to create the national strategy. Use that to prioritize, bring the specific teams forward in the road mappings, and then move through program execution and review. In terms of the framework that we discussed, the framework really came down to 4 legs. One criteria for assessing is around national strategic needs, particularly defense, energy, food, health, homeland, and economic security. The second was around global market demand and addressing the potential of the targeted technologies in the multiple markets that it can hit and the opportunities for growth. The third piece was U.S. industrial competitiveness today and understanding what was either holding that back or would be required. And the fourth piece is around technology readiness. Were really the 4 areas that we propose the initial framework. And I won't belabor, there are multiple tables and concepts that we went through, but simply in the context of helping to level set the realities as we look at these 4 dimensions, what the implication is and what the role, quite frankly, would be for government, industry, and academia, and a public-private partnership model to move those forward. The next piece of, once we had the framework for the permanent model, also identification of the top cross-cutting technologies. There are a net of 11 that were identified, and they're listed here, moving from additive manufacturing and the opportunities emerging of cost-competitive 3D printing, from everything for intermetallics for metal aircraft to human bone transplant to now even advancing to a variety of nanomanufacturing processes and multi-material systems. Next piece is really around advanced forming and joining technologies, the movement to lightweight materials and the drivers around energy efficiency and dissimilar materials coming forward and what's required in this domain. In concert with that are advanced materials design, synthesis, and processing, and the overlay in a variety of areas as it impacts power electronics, new energy systems. A large space that emerged on multiple factors, and really ultimately we split into two categories. One in advanced sensing, measurement, and process control, but tightly coupled with that is also visualization, informatics, and digital manufacturing technologies. Both in the a priori design and in the latter and in the former, really incorporation of advanced sensing measurement systems across the board in the manufacturing process, as well as new product design. Sustainable manufacturing hit around energy efficiency, reduced raw materials utilization, and reuse of materials. And then we have nano manufacturing, flexible electronics, the biomanufacturing, and the test equipment, robotics. Another key leg on enabling innovation was a call out of the key gap that often is called the valley of death between the early phase inventive process and early basic science and proof of concept, and that of real systems development and design. And recognizing this, there is a call for formation of the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes. In the respect, and I'll show in the next slide, of really the opportunity to bring industry and academia, but also the community college network in the U.S. together for hands-on learning, as well as the ability really to put national networks in place to share best practices and make available for small and medium enterprises. The concept is the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes would be co-led with industry and academic partners. There would be multiple industry members, and that the facilities would not necessarily be a pure grassroots build it and they will come, as has sometimes been the case in these types of institutes, but there would be co-investment from day one, of particularly given the footprints that a number of the industry members already have in place. There was, right after the announcement of the recommendations for the Advanced Manufacturing Program, in fact, there was a pilot, and an Additive Manufacturing Innovation Institute call came forward in July, and in August there was an announcement of award for additive manufacturing. In this case, it is an award that is being really led with Honeywell and Boeing. But there are a network of 40 companies, 9 universities, 5 community colleges, and a number of nonprofits engaged. 30 million federal funding and 40 million matching and partnerships. The key, however, was being one of the initial calls was the speed at which industry responded. My understanding is there were at least 12, if not more, proposals that had come forward. They were very regionally centric, and over 400 million in matching dollars from the industry partners. The other areas in enabling innovation really hit two improvements in industry-university collaboration, addressing, in this case, some tax policy constraints that are limiting the amount of private investment that can occur at university, and unfortunately what that does in minimizing the degree of collaborative interaction that has evolved in the industry-university partnership. So really some very tangible actions, but are quite, I think, specific and unique to the U.S. We also had a call for establishment of a National Advanced Manufacturing Portal, which really isn't being driven through NIST and the MEP organization, to make available to small and medium enterprises the vast network of capabilities that are available to them. And as we well know, many small and medium enterprises just don't have the capabilities and infrastructure and even that single site that they can pull from. The next piece around securing a talent pipeline really had multiple legs, and I'll quickly go through these, but they're really absolutely paramount for renewal. The first piece was one of the challenge of repositioning manufacturing in the eyes of the future workforce. And the phrase of conversion of dull, dirty, and dangerous to exciting, engaging, essential, and environmentally sustainable is one that's being done in concert with industry members and Ad Council, and also pushed by the members of really getting out in front and opening our facilities to the community so that they can see what advanced manufacturing is of today and engagement of the future workforce. The second one really pertains to the gap that exists in openings for skilled labor versus filling those slots, and a call of really engaging the returning veterans in this particular case into this job programs. Now, coupled with that is actually the fourth bullet on adaptable, stackable credentials. In the U.S., we have the opportunity to do a much better job for our professional trades to build a stackable skill credential program to enable over the lifetime for the professional trade to build their net skills. And in fact, there's partnership now going with the Department of Defense of embedding that skill accreditation as part of the veterans training to help facilitate the reemergence as they come into the advanced manufacturing sector. Also, very key investment in community colleges. A number of large companies, ourselves included, have very strong partnerships with our local community colleges for training and curriculum development, but a realization that those best practices for hands-on learning need to be multiplied across the nation. The piece on improving university programs really comes to the recognition of the need for both ABET accreditation and also universities for bachelor's, master's, but particularly the master's degree on manufacturing, engineering, expertise and training, revitalization. And the last piece pertains to fellowships and internships of a number of the interagencies where there is funding for graduate fellowships that overlay with advanced manufacturing to incorporate into that internship opportunities. The last piece is around improving business climate, very much overlay with recommendations that have emerged from the Business Council and elsewhere. So I won't belabor these, largely driven around strengthening and making permanent the R&D tax credit, addressing corporate tax rates, also in the regulations area, driving for smarter regulations and the need for early engagement and better cost-benefit analysis, using best available science, and looking at international best practices to ensure we're driving international best practices around the globe. Relative to trade policy, really addressing a number of the non-tariff barriers, especially as it applies to regulations and standards and enforcement on IP control and the like. And the fourth piece is a very important one, as we all know, on energy policy and its pivotal role in the decisions of energy-intensive industries and their choices within the U.S. and the underpinning policies that can move forward from energy efficiency and conservation to the design and support for appropriate use of domestic supplies and investments on cost-competitive renewals. So this gives you a flavor of the context of the top recommendations that have come forward. Again, the intent of the AMP program was really around reinventing manufacturing and a look towards the future and where those recommendations need to move forward from a U.S. context. But much of the learning and methodology, quite frankly, could be highly leverageable around the globe and is really a strong function of what the domestic driving forces of strengths and coupling that with the global trade opportunities. So with that, I'll close and open for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Teresa. It's fascinating. I think the emphasis on public-private partnerships, this initiative for the establishment of a series of manufacturing innovation centres across the United States, the emphasis on improved university-industry collaboration. I suspect much scope for that in Australia. Also an emphasis on talent. We've got a session later today on educating for the sector. a challenge for Australia also, and the research and incentives, investment incentive program that's being offered, quite a comprehensive assessment of the industry in the United States and a comprehensive plan for the future. Who's got time for about 5 minutes of questions? First one? Yep.
Sorry. Thanks so much for that. Thank you. Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. Just a quick one. You mentioned that one of the challenges here is to reposition manufacturing in a broad sense, and one of the things that you're wanting to do is change people's image of manufacturing. You mentioned you want to change it to exciting, smart, environmentally sound, etc. And then you mentioned when you focused on sustainable manufacturing, the focus was just on eco-efficiency. I wonder if you'd like to explain why you didn't also focus on the potential of manufacturing products through the whole economy to make a difference on our environment, and how that could really help you rebrand and communicate the potential to the best and brightest that through manufacturing they can change the world.
Mm-hmm. I think it actually was incorporated throughout the discussion around this, and so my call out on the eco-efficiency was just by giving a flavor of a target of some of the initial technologies. And by that, for instance, when we surveyed the entire group, both large and small companies, and asked what they felt were the most critical technologies for investment, we had a response of over 90% across all industries and all sectors around energy efficiency, both in the design of the process, but also in the products coming forward and how that will drive a more sustainable future. And then incorporating that, again, many of these are cross-cutting from the additive manufacturing and other sectors, really leading new product design and new product by process design.
Another question? If I could be a bit provocative, Teresa, when I read the report, I was a little surprised that there wasn't more emphasis on the green growth opportunities, both the demand that's going to be upon us all to use natural resources more efficiently and create less waste, but also the business opportunities that will come out of that. And I was wondering, as I was reading it, whether the political elite in the US has become a bit nervous in this area, and that's why there wasn't the emphasis.
Well, I don't know, Robert, if you had the opportunity to read the appendices or if you read the main report. I
read the main report. Really, I didn't get to the appendices.
Right. The appendices really began to call out more of this in detail. And so for each of the work streams, there is a report typically on the same length as the main body of the report that really pulled further into both future materials, critical materials selection and needs, and overall recognition of the go-forward vitality of building and designing for more material and energy effective processes.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yep, one.
Teresa, it's Tom Harley here. I just wondered if you could wind the clock forward. What's going to happen next? How's the report been greeted, both positively and negatively? What have been the criticisms and what's been highlighted?
Very good question. And we've got a number of actions in place. The Advanced Manufacturing National Program Office, in fact, I was in Washington, D.C. last week. We had a briefing with the House Manufacturing Caucus to review the recommendations that have come forward, also Woodrow Wilson Policy Group, and then are also working with each of the individual agencies. The recommendations, we've laid out short, medium, and long-term action plans that are in some cases very much relevant to individual agencies or are cross-agency engagement. And so that's really where the focus is now, laying out the specific go forward, who's taking accountability. Of course, we're in a challenging time period in the U.S. for the upcoming election. But we continue to raise this as a bipartisan issue, and business doesn't stop. We need to continue to press forward. The other piece that's a very important one is the partnership with the state and regional economic development boards. I would say one facet as I look at the AMP recommendations, we didn't spend as much time as we likely could have or should have on the financial instrument side of the equation. That was not where we spent as much time. But having said that, the go forward, we're working now really to drive the dialogue with the state economic development councils and their regional strategies and plans and the opportunity to engage. This is very much coupled with the Manufacturing Innovation Institute initiative and the go forward investments.
Well, I think we'll let Teresa. I think we'll let Teresa take a late dinner. It's been very good of her to stay up at night to join us from Midland, Michigan. A good test of the new globalised technologies, I have to say, and I'm pleased that it worked in the end. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for your coming and joining us in this way today, but thank you also for your public contribution in this area. You've obviously put in an enormous effort, and I hope the American people appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, that quite comprehensive summary of the new US policy is a great way to lead into the presentation of Professor Roy Green, which is the Australian perspective on this issue. Roy, of course, is well known to all of you as Dean of the Business School at the University of Technology, Sydney. But he's become very much, I think, the go-to person on advanced manufacturing within the university sector in Australia. He's very much sought by all of those who are seeking wise counsel in this area, including our Prime Minister, and thus he's played a key role in her task force in the development of a new Australian policy in the area. So, Roy, would you like to come up here and give us the Australian perspective, and we'll then make the assessment whether Australia or the US might be heading in which is heading in a better direction?
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, thank you, Robert, and thanks to the United States Studies Centre for organising this event. Pardon my voice, I've just got back from Europe and inevitably something hit me on the plane, but I'll struggle through. And it was deeply impressive to listen to Teresa and in particular appreciate the depth of research that has gone into the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership report in the US. We can't claim to have conducted new and original research for our report apart from data search, but we have drawn on a wide range of research conducted both in Australia and internationally to define the vision that the Prime Minister required us to set out, a shared vision as the terms of reference put it, for the future of manufacturing in Australia, and in particular advanced manufacturing, although we have to recognise in Australia, as I think people do in the US, that most manufacturing is in fact not high tech, it's not advanced, it's medium to low tech. Even in the Nordic countries and in Germany, manufacturing is concentrated in bulk chemicals, car manufacturing, steel making. These are still the largest employing areas of manufacturing, and do they have a future in Australia and in developed economies, especially high-cost economies like Australia now, as they have done in Germany and in the Nordic countries, or is there an inevitable process of offshoring? The report in Australia's case arose from the panic, I guess we could say, of a year or so ago when 100,000 jobs were lost in Australian manufacturing over a 2-year period, but combined also with a more fundamental reassessment of the future of manufacturing in Australia. And we are well aware of editorial writers who not only don't think there is a future, but actually celebrate the possibility that there may be no future for manufacturing, using rather stale static equilibrium models of the economy which see manufacturing engaged in some kind of zero-sum game with new and emerging industries, and in particular with the mining sector and with services, as though these are incompatible. But what this doesn't take account of are new approaches to economics based on growth economics, evolutionary economics, that incorporate an understanding of technological change and innovation in the way we conduct public policy, and in the way in which we understand the role of manufacturing and its contribution. So this is the task force report. As you'll see, it's from the non-government members. It is the Prime Minister's task force, but the Prime Minister and the ministers excused themselves from this process and enabled the non-government members, who were made up of 6 industry leaders and 6 trade union leaders and a couple of us academics, to develop the report according to the terms of reference. And the industry leaders were a spread of large international companies, Boeing, Thales, Kraft, as well as Australian local companies like Textor, the Smart Fabrics company in Melbourne, and One Steel, and of course the Australian Industry Group. And the report was assisted greatly by contributions, in particular by Dow, and the process led by Andrew Liveris, who of course was heavily involved in the, and indeed co-chair of the Obama Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, and the Managing Director in Australia, Craig Arnold, who's with us today, who published the Advanced Manufacturing Plan for Australia. As well as that, some very important contributions by other stakeholders, in particular the CSIRO, and we're going to hear from Swee Mac a bit later about CSIRO's particular vision of manufacturing as well. So this is the report which you're all invited to have a look at. It made 41 recommendations altogether, perhaps a little bit too many to absorb in one hit, but nevertheless there are 5 key areas which I'll come to at the end where the key recommendations do have, I think, great salience for Australia. But let's begin with the question that is asked in the report and is inevitably asked, as it was in the Obama case. What is the role of manufacturing in advanced economies? Does it have a role? And of course, we argue not only does it have a role, but it's absolutely vital to the future of advanced and developed economies. It is not something that we can afford to offshore and replace by mining and services. It just wouldn't work for the growth and increased income and standard of living of our economies. And I was reminded of this last week because I was in Germany and in particular in Baden-Württemberg, which is the area characterised by the Mittelstand, the small to medium-sized German manufacturing companies which are the backbone of the German economy. And I was in a place which most Germans have never heard of, called Schwenningen in Baden-Württemberg, where we have a partner university, the Hochschule Furtwangen. And they reminded me that this was part of the old clock-making district of Germany. And now that clock-making is not really pursued to the extent that it was in the past, it has been replaced in the ingenuity and skill and ecosystem that was created by clockmaking has now been transferred to surgical instruments. And to see these companies and the ecosystem in which they operate with universities is quite a revelation for us in Australia. The deep engagement of local universities, both in terms of the research programs that they conduct. They don't have a research measurement exercise in Germany that simply rates academics by publications in top journals. This is part of it, of course, but they also pay a great deal of attention to the level of engagement and relevance of research, as well as of teaching. And so students are automatically interned in local companies. Managers of those companies teach in the programs in engineering, in business and design, and there are constant updates to ensure that teaching programs are not only reflecting what is going on in the manufacturing sector in Germany at any one time, but is anticipating trends 5 or 10 years into the future with technology foresight exercises conducted by the local governments and by the national government in Berlin. And this is why a great deal of emphasis is placed in Germany, as it should be in Australia and the United States, on the role of manufacturing in driving technological change and innovation. About a quarter of our R&D in Australia is conducted in manufacturing, and it is the key driver of technological change, not just in manufacturing itself, but in other sectors, in the mining industry included, in infrastructure. It is the skills that are developed within manufacturing which apply, and hence the second reason, which is the contribution of manufacturing to the growth of high skill, high productivity jobs, not just within manufacturing, because although manufacturing only accounts for 10% of national output in Australia and about that level of employment, about the same numbers employed as was the case in the 1960s, nevertheless, the value of that output has increased several-fold, reflecting high levels of productivity growth over that period, and the contribution of the manufacturing sector to the growth of jobs in the rest of the economy, in services in particular. And services are now so highly integrated with manufacturing that it's not possible in some cases to draw any practical distinction. Manufacturing is packaged within services activities, and production itself may only be a very small proportion of the value added by manufacturing, and we see this in some of the high-tech products around the world. The Apple iPhone is something whose value is created largely by the brand as well as by the manufacturing component. And the third important contribution of manufacturing is, of course, to our external account. Wouldn't we be punished, as other economies are at the present time, if we had to borrow in order to fund our consumer imports? As long as we can produce sufficient exports, we can afford the standard of living that we currently have. The external account is an important area of contribution to the economy by manufacturing, and we see this most particularly now with the mining boom, which I guess some members of the government don't really want to consider to be a boom, but part of a natural evolution of the economy is inevitably coming to an end, or at least the phase of high commodity prices is coming to an end. And we see this and the danger facing us in this chart. If you look at the last two columns in particular, you'll see that the blue section is the contribution of productivity to the growth in national income. But in the next bar at the end, the blue section has dropped to about half, and the other half is made up largely of the contribution made to our national income by the growth in the terms of trade over the last few years. And that growth in the terms of trade is, of course, driven by high commodity prices, which is China's, as the economist Bob Gregory points out, is China's gift to us. 15% of our national income is a gift from China. We haven't increased our production. We're selling the same commodities as we did yesterday, but we're being paid more for them. Now, the next phase of the commodity boom is going to be expanded production. There's the construction industry work around the mining towns, and that employs a few people. And then we have the mining production itself, which doesn't employ very many people at all. A lot of it is controlled by robots from Perth. So the idea that anyone had that unemployed manufacturing workers would gravitate to Port Hedland does seem a little far-fetched. These could well be ghost towns if that is the idea that we attempted to implement. And it is a bit ironic, I have to say, that the same people who said to us a couple of years ago, look, the boom is here to stay. It's not a boom, it's a structural adjustment in our economy, and we have to downsize our manufacturing to make way for it. Why can't you people see that? The same people who are now saying, surely you didn't think that this wasn't a short-term boom. Surely you realise it had to come to an end. surely you now have to adjust to this fact. Well, in the manufacturing report, we point out that manufacturing is not like Lake Eyre. You don't have a drought and it fills up automatically. Once you lose those capabilities and skills, they don't come back very easily. But this is the challenge that now faces us. Once that grey bit is gone, the emphasis is going to be back on raising our national productivity growth. And where is that going to come from? Australia's labour productivity growth is now well below the OECD average. We see in the 1990s we had a brief period when our labour productivity growth was above the OECD average, and now it's dropped back. And this is a great cause of concern for policymakers, as it should be. But even more disturbingly, when we look at multi-factor productivity growth, which takes into account the contribution of capital as well as labour, we find that our multi-factor productivity growth has actually gone backwards. Now, there's a number of factors involved here. Can't go into great detail, but obviously there are some factors which are relatively temporary. Some of the growth of productivity in the 1990s was due to the massive corporatisation and privatisation of our utilities industry and the short-term changes brought about in that context. Some of the downturn now is due to the reduction in productivity growth in the mining industry, where we have a lot of investment but not too much output to show for it as yet. That will change. And so the downturn may not be as dramatic as it appears here, but there is nevertheless a downturn right across industry, including in manufacturing, and that's going to have to be addressed, because if we don't, we're rapidly becoming uncompetitive. And we needn't become uncompetitive, even in a high-cost economy, if our productivity growth is sufficient. And we see here unit labour cost comparisons. That's the cost per unit of output of labour. And we find that even though we have an inflation rate not dissimilar to the rest of the world, because our labour productivity is lagging so far behind, our growth in average unit labour costs is much greater than our competitors, including high-cost countries like Sweden, Finland, Germany, and so on. So if our manufacturing is to succeed, this is where we need to put some of our focus. Certainly some of the broader measures as well, which I'll come to, but these issues that address the productivity challenge are the ones that we should also address in the manufacturing context. And this is a chart showing, looking at the real exchange rate and showing the loss of Australia's competitiveness compared with the Euro area and the United States. As you go up the chart, you're losing competitiveness, and that's the blue line, Australia. So this was anticipated some years ago, and let's just go into the background a little bit first before we come back to our report. The Venturous Australia report, the Cutler Review of the National Innovation System, made a number of findings which it called upon the Australian government to implement. The first thing it noted was that there had been a large drop over the years in Australia's investment in knowledge. If this is a source of our productivity growth, then certainly the lack of it would go some way towards explaining the decline over the last few years. Here we compare some countries which are in the forefront of knowledge-based manufacturing, Sweden, Finland, but we also look at a couple of resource-based economies, Norway, Canada, and we're assessing them on the basis of a measurement that was developed by the OECD, which incorporates investment in higher education as a proportion of GDP, investment in R&D as a proportion of GDP, and investment in ICT, which is a kind of proxy for technological proficiency. And they're combined into a composite index, the knowledge index. And this is where we are. So this was what the Cutler Review wanted government to address, and certainly to build up government, but also business contributions to R&D and higher education. And it identified the lack of a coherent national innovation system in Australia. If we want it's a review of the national innovation system, but it found essentially that we didn't have one. And this is absolutely vital for the future of manufacturing, that we have a surrounding ecosystem, a national innovation system, and one that operates at local level, connecting public agencies, research and education, finance, and where it all counts for productivity, the transformation of enterprises and workplaces. It also placed a great deal of emphasis on moving policy not so much away from the supply side, but away from the almost exclusive emphasis on supply side measures towards the demand side. By supply side, we mean lots of public money for public research, and we don't really care how the research is used. We just hope that it has some impact of benefit to the economy. Well, that is not necessarily the case. The UK did a similar review a few years ago, the Sainsbury review, in which it found that a lot of the research that was being conducted was lacking the commercialisation context which would enable it to have any impact at all. And that's the case in Australia as well. So demand side measures, looking at the technology absorption capacity of workplaces, how do we create that demand? Looking at public procurement, looking at policies that will get the industry sectors energised around the use of research, as important as generating the research in the first place. And that was the purpose of the Powering Ideas White Paper that appeared in 2009, which also focused on management practices at the level of the workplace, because as part of a global study which we were involved in, it was found that productivity was very closely associated with the calibre of management. And the calibre of management in Australia was not at the bottom of this list of 16 countries, but nor was it at the top. I won't go into these measurements, but suffice it to say that this is a composite measure across 18 characteristics of management, and better management in this survey, which was incorporated into the manufacturing report, was that better management is associated with larger and more globalised companies, as you might expect, because of the recruitment and staff development practices of those companies. Also with decision-making autonomy at plant level, which isn't always the case in Australia, and most particularly the emphasis on skills and education. And Australian managers have one of the lowest levels of tertiary qualifications of any managers in the 16-country study. But most particularly where we fell most short of world best practice in management proficiency across the 18 characteristics that are shown here is in this particular area, instilling a talent mindset. The blue bar being on all of those characteristics Australian performance, and the red bar being world best practice. We're lagging very far behind in what is effectively a proxy for innovation. And it's this factor which is incorporated by the report into its definition of what it requires, what is required for success in a high-cost economy by manufacturers. Clearly, a capable entrepreneurial leadership, a knowledge-intensive process with committed employees with whom management engages, high-performance, high-quality product service system, globalised processes, part of global supply chains, closeness to customers, integrated innovation. I won't go into that in detail because I want to come now to the recommendations of the report itself, which mirror in many ways the conclusions and the recommendations of the Obama Task Force or Partnership report that Teresa presented earlier. And I won't go into as much detail as she did on the individual recommendations. There were 41, as I mentioned, but there are 5 areas where we felt that change could be made effectively in the short and the longer term. And it's those 5 areas that we have, and each of them contains a number of separate recommendations. It's those 5 areas where we would like the government to concentrate on the next stage of this process, which, by the way, incorporates, it doesn't end here, it incorporates an industry statement which the government is preparing as we speak to be released probably November or early December. And this will be the industry white paper that will comprise the measures that will be introduced by the government, and hopefully we'll have some, and it is really, I guess, Oscar Wilde's triumph of hope over experience here. Hopefully we'll have some bipartisan support, because these will be measures that have incorporated the views of industry leaders across the economy. So the short-term adjustment issue is, well, what do we do about job losses in current manufacturing operations? We can see that there are still some companies which are teetering on the edge. We do need some degree of labour adjustment, some degree of retraining. Some people are simply not going to be operating in a competitive environment, and their companies are going to close. There's absolutely no point in keeping companies open that don't have markets and have no potential to create markets. Clearly we want to introduce innovation processes so that competitiveness can be increased, and we move as many companies as we can into higher value adding production, but it isn't always going to be the case. And so adjustment measures are going to be required in some cases, and it's important that any government has those in place. We had them in place, as you might recall, with the major adjustments to tariff reductions in the 1980s and 1990s. Similar measures are called for again, and such measures were put into place, for example, with the downsizing of BlueScope in Wollongong quite recently. The second area are economy-wide measures, some of which are about maintaining and creating demand in the economy as a whole, which is in itself an important productivity-enhancing measure, but also in other productivity-enhancing contexts, such as commitment to infrastructure investment, tax changes. All of these are detailed in the report, and some of them are very similar to the kind of recommendations that were made in the Obama statement. But the last three are the really, I think, innovative areas of the report. The first two are fairly standard responses to a manufacturing downturn. The last three are new. And the first one, Smarter Networks, is about the creation of innovation hubs and precincts in Australia. There was a fair bit of emphasis on that, the manufacturing institutes in the Obama report. This is absolutely central to the recommendations in this report. It hasn't been done before in Australia in any coherent way. In fact, support for industry clusters has never been part of Commonwealth government policy, and yet industry clustering, geographically concentrated groups of companies who are linked through customer-supplier relationships or through complementary R&D activities. These are the source of a lot of competitive advantage around the world. Tom Friedman wrote the book about the competing in a flat world a few years ago, but the response of Richard Florida in the Atlantic Monthly was to say, no, the world is actually spiky because we have these nodes of superior competitive advantage driven by ingenuity and to some extent by local relationships among companies that are, as in the case of the German town I mentioned earlier, part of innovation and in particular manufacturing ecosystems. So how do we get the resources together? We don't have the resources of the United States to do this. How do we get the resources together to develop these innovation hubs and precincts? How do we identify which ones we wish to invest in? Well, the first thing to do is to look at the amount of public funding and some private funding which is already being expended in such programs or is committed to such programs. The government announced a Manufacturing Technology Innovation Centre in the last budget. That's about $40 million. It has also announced an an industrial transformation research hubs program. It already has Australian Research Council linkage programs. It has the Cooperative Research Centre programs. We have a lot of programs, but with little coherence around them, and without in many cases, any sense of where the priorities lie. How do we identify where our capabilities exist, and how do we capitalise on those most effectively using the resources we've got? That's what this section of the report is about, and it draws upon examples around the world of smart specialisation, as it's called in Europe, or industry clustering, or regional innovation networks. These are all the terminologies that are used basically for the same thing, which is to build up the relationship, the intensity of the relationship, which we're not good at in Australia. We're right down the bottom of the OECD table, between our research and education institutions, which include universities and CSIRO and other agencies, NICTA, for example, and our industries, and in particular our manufacturing industries. We just don't have, except in a number of very excellent cases, which Andrew Stoner, the Deputy Premier, mentioned earlier, we just don't do them well. Andrew Stoner mentioned Cochlear. Well, there's an example of a company started by an ARC linkage grant. He mentioned Breville, he mentioned First Solar, and the emphasis on renewable energy sources. There are others. Techstore, who were on the manufacturing task force, smart fabric producer, using the government researchers in business program, brings a CSIRO researcher into the company to develop smart fabrics for Kimberly-Clark, and named Global Supplier of the Year by Kimberly-Clark out of all the thousands of suppliers around the world. Similarly, Ferra Engineering in Queensland, named Global Supplier of the Year by Boeing out of 120,000 suppliers. Quite extraordinary. We can do it here, and if you hear Phil Butler, the CEO of Techstore, interviewed, he's asked many times, isn't the dollar squeezing your business? You know, how can you survive? He says, I think it's wonderful because I can buy my capital equipment more cheaply than ever. So there's another side to the high dollar. Other examples include Hoffman Engineering in Perth, who brought the Mittelstand to Perth, in a sense, in the mining engineering sector, a micro multinational, and this is where the future lies. A micro multinational closely associated with universities, not only supplying to the mining industry, which is one of our competitive strengths in Australia, of course, and will be for a very long time, but also to the mining industries of Peru and Chile and around the world. In South Australia, Clipsal Engineering, who do switches, fairly basic product. It's not just about high tech and the science and technology end of this marketplace. It's also around medium tech, where non-technological forms of innovation become so important. And this is also part of this smarter networks concept, that non-technological forms of innovation, new business models, design integration, systems integration, high-performance work and management practices also become part of our competitive advantage. I just might mention a report in the Mittelstand a couple of years ago, a survey of 6,000 companies found that among the medium tech companies, most of them innovated through non-technological forms of innovation in the Mittelstand. Only at the highest level does science and technology innovation become the most important thing for them. It's obviously important, and the universities contribute to it, and the Fraunhofer Institutes can contribute, but it's only part of the innovation process. The second of these three areas is smarter SMEs. I'll come to a conclusion very shortly. And that is building on the public policy that we already have in this area, in particular Enterprise Connect, which supplies services to SMEs to upgrade their systems, new accounting systems, new HR systems. But what we advocate in this report is that we should certainly increase the operation of Enterprise Connect in scale, because it's an excellent program, but we ought also to take it up to the next level, beyond business improvement to enterprise transformation. Because unless we can do the enterprise transformation bit, we're not going to get into that competitive space which is required for a high-cost economy. We have to compete on the basis of knowledge intensity, on the basis of the value adding that we can provide through ingenuity, new business models, relentless innovation, connections with our research and education institutions, not simply on the basis of costs. And so transforming our SMEs in this way is a critical part of the pathway that is being proposed in the report. And there are a number of recommendations associated with that, which I won't go into in detail, but we can talk about them afterwards. And the final section of these three really critical areas is smarter workplaces. And this arises from the finding that we have around management practices and certainly in our SMEs, a long tail of poor management performance. And how do we address that? Because it's often the companies that have that poor performance that are not the ones that wish to come forward to seek support and advice and, if possible, some reconstruction of the way they operate. So we must develop programs that will have some chance of intervention in companies that will enable them to not only survive the downturn that they're facing, but also move into that competitive space where a high-cost economy requires them to be if they're to survive and to produce for local and international marketplaces. And to do so just not in the context of their own regions, but also as part of global supply chains. As I said earlier, the future for many of these companies lies in becoming a micro multinational. Not in a big company, they don't have to be a big company, but they have to understand their place within a global supply chain. And that applies as much to some of our larger industries as well. In car manufacturing, for example, there's a lot of discussion in the paper this morning and yesterday about Ford. You know, how's that going to survive as an autonomous car manufacturer in Australia? Well, the time has come for all of these manufacturers, and General Motors is already moving in this direction, to integrate with global car production. It's the only way that we're going to be able to retain any car making capability in Australia at all, and certainly retain the design and R&D competitive edge that we currently have, because we do contribute to global supply chains in many ways already. We produce parts for BMWs, for example. So we're capable of doing it, and we've shown in a number of cases with very successful companies that manufacturing can have a future here. But there's a lot of companies out there that with some enabling policies and focus on enabling technologies and on the public policy environment for closer collaboration, integration with global supply chains, higher caliber management practices, could be so much more successful, and that's what this report is essentially about. So thank you.
Take one question. Of course, it's at a different stage, isn't it? I read the American report, and it's much more top-down, but that is the policy of government. This is a contribution to a policy of government that we're yet to see. And a lot of the ideas are similar, but you sense in the American one there's a driving determination from the top to achieve certain outcomes by the investment of public money and public advocacy and so forth. One question. Yep.
Thanks, Robert. Roy, one of the things that Teresa pointed out was that their report was not looking at picking technologies, but picking challenges and opportunities in the global marketplace. But they did go to pick those opportunities and challenges for their own economy. Our government seems very hesitant to even address that and let the market decide. Would you like to comment on that and in reference to your deliberations?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and it was well put by Teresa that government in the US wishes to focus on problem statements rather than picking products, but they are picking enabling technologies, and I certainly think that is one of the weaknesses of the report. I don't think anyone felt sufficiently confident enough on the basis of the limited research that was undertaken to make that leap, but there was certainly a lot of discussion about the kind of technologies that would become relevant for us, and some of them are very similar to the ones discussed by Teresa. They're certainly part of the CSIRO contribution, and we'll hear more from Sui about that a bit later on. An excellent contribution around additive manufacturing, around robotics, around areas where we do have some strength in our universities, in the medical technology sector as well. There are things that we ought to be able to draw on and which we ought to be confident enough to identify and resource in relation to industrial ecosystems in the context of an industry statement, and hopefully that will emerge in the end.
So we should pick sectors. I think it's time for morning tea. We get 15 minutes for morning tea, and we will go into Sri Mak after morning tea, who heads up CSIRO's future manufacturing flagship, so it'll be interesting to see how this is working out in practice. And then Bob Clark, no better person qualified to talk about how we can take advantage of our natural resource advantages, in particular natural gas. So that fits in well with the American presentation, I think. Thank you very much, Roy, for that, and for your contribution to public policy.
Okay, thanks.